Our study tonight will continue from the book of Proverbs, and it'll be wisdom regarding family will be our topic. Before we get started, let's have prayer. Father, we thank you so much for this day and this opportunity we have to come together in a fellowship and be with each other this week. And just thank you for this beautiful weather and as we've traveled and worked this week, that you've watched over and protected us during this time. And help us as we study your word, that we will have a good discussion and learn from your word tonight. We just ask you to help those within our church and community that are sick or hurting right now, that need you, that you would just be with them in their needs. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We will start in Proverbs 11:29 will be the first verse we'll look at, and we'll kind of have the similar format with going through a lot of the verses through Proverbs that Chris has been doing, with an emphasis on wisdom and how we can use that in our family lives and at home. So within this study, and the commentator with this mentions two things that we should be mindful of as we continue this study. He said, number one, life is short. And number two, our eternal existence is greatly influenced in what we do in that short life. And so I think there's an emphasis on we're not here long. What impact can we have while we're here? How can we impact others? And one of the most important ways to impact is through our family, whether it be immediate family or as we go through extended family. And just some just things on how we can develop our family relationships at home. So as we start out in Proverbs 11:29, it says, "Those who trouble their households will inherit wind, and the fool will be a servant to the wise." So the idea, I feel like, is, sometimes maybe you hear of instances where people are looking to cause problems, looking to be divisive over things, trying to make it harder for a family. We know not everyone has that perfect situation, with working in public school system, you see those things where there's not always the family dynamic. Also, there's so many books out there on this is how you parent, and help books for parents, parenting books. I just remember seeing them all throughout the years. There's a lot of famous studies from like the 50s, 60s, 70s going up, and this is how we raise kids now, and you've got to be nurturing, and you can't get on to them. There's the whole, and we'll talk about it towards the end, but, are you allowed to spank a child? And, the different strategies, sit them in timeout, for 2 minutes or whatever based on their age. So there's so many things. And it's funny with a lot of those studies and those books that these doctors write, like usually 10 or 15 years later, they'll come out and say, well, they were wrong. Like everything we said was probably not good. And then we usually have to try to correct it. Or parents just thinking, I'm going to try my way. I'm not going to listen to how maybe my parents did it, or, my neighbors, how they would do it. I'm just going to go my own way. But with this study tonight, I want us just to focus in Proverbs on what does Proverbs say about what's important at home, and what knowledge we can get from Proverbs for our families. So hopefully we'll have some good discussion tonight. There's some things I think, I'd love to have everybody's input on as we go through here. One of the first things he wants to mention when it says providing for your family, like what is the most important thing? And I think sometimes we can get our priorities out of order. But what are the necessities in life? What are the things that are a good thing that you need to provide for your family? What are the most important? But then are some things luxuries? We just, if we don't have to necessarily turn there, but Luke 12, 16 through 21, just a reminder, Brad did a lesson recently on the landowner, the farmer who wanted to tear down his barns to provide more. And we talked about, was that necessary? Was that the right thing to do? Was that greed and all that? So there are some things, that are more important than others, and how do we place those priorities? So then, once we think about what is most important within our family dynamic, where should our emphasis be? And so let's turn to Proverbs 15, 16. And so one of the first things mentioned here is instilling the fear of the Lord. So I think Chris has talked about having that. We've had, I think, one or two Wednesday night discussions on fear of the Lord, what that is. But Proverbs 15, 16 says, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. And if we go back to a little earlier in Luke 12, we see two brothers fighting over an inheritance. So we have two brothers causing problems within their family, and it's all based on money and wanting it divided. So at the end of Luke 12, it says, so it with those he stored up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. So this idea at the end of the story Jesus told was there wasn't this fear of what God could do. There was only a concern with greed, their riches, their things they had. They did not have any regard for what was right. Things that we've already discussed this quarter on fear of the Lord, what that provides is knowledge. We've seen Proverbs 10:27 about prolonging your life. It's a way to avoid sin. And true wealth, that's actually what God would want us to have, is through having that fear of the Lord first. So one of the most important things we probably could give to our families based on that is instilling that fear of the Lord. Anybody have any comments so far before we keep going about having that fear of the Lord? And I know, like I said, we've kind of covered that previously. Number two is giving them love. If we look at Proverbs 15, 17. Proverbs 15, 17 says, better is a dinner of vegetables where love is than a fatted ox and hatred with it. Some of you may like a dinner of vegetables. I don't know, I probably wouldn't. But the idea is, as long as love is there within your family, you can do without some of the more luxuries, some of the things that we may think we have to have. And that love and providing that environment of love would be far more important than just giving your kids everything they want and providing them with things that may not be as important. And then there's the idea, he mentions that troubled children come from homes where love is lacking, not money. So it's important to obviously instill within our family and to our children that love in that household. Proverbs 17:1. Better is a dry morsel with quiet than a house full of feasting with strife. So again, having peace within the family, oftentimes with adding unnecessary things, we're just opening up more things to fight about. It's especially, I think, with a family of 5 kids, it's the more they have, there's just more to fight over. And it's, there's people that talk about if you get 2 little kids in a room together, they may even have the same exact toy, but they'll always want the other one's toy. Like it's in our nature to want that. The commentator goes on to say, a wise father or mother realizes that spiritual provisions are more important than material ones. They will see that the family receives what is truly important, even if it means cutting back on things that are not. We look at the prodigal son, another situation where brothers, you would think if you have a long-lost brother that came back and, saw the error of their ways and wanted to reunite with the family, he would have been rejoicing, but he wasn't. He was worried about the thing, like he knew that he was supposed to get everything his dad had, and he's giving some of it away to the son that came back. And so there was strife and conflict with that. Instead of, loving his brother, wanting him to come back, we know that he was upset by it. Any comments about any of that? In a few minutes, I'm going to ask y'all some questions that you're going to have to comment on. But jump in anytime. But I have some questions at the end that we're going to talk about. The next one, he talks about ensuring adequate provisions, or what does it look like, if we're wanting to provide for our families. And it's just like Matthew 6:33 says, if you seek God first, all the other things will fall into place. That God wants to bless us. But if we focus on the things that we want, that's not how we get it. We get it first by seeking God, His kingdom, the things that are important, and then the other things will come. Similar to what we've talked about most of this quarter, if we look at Proverbs 24, verses 3 and 4. By wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. If we focus on acquiring that wisdom and knowledge and not wealth, again, we can actually have the things we need, and as the Lord blesses, we can establish more wealth for ourselves, that through loving God and serving His will, that those things can come. Careful study, and that's what I've really enjoyed the quarter with Chris in Proverbs, just the guidance, the wisdom, the application from the book of Proverbs that we've been able to have. I do want us to look at Colossians 2. Colossians 2, verses 2 and 3. I want their hearts to be encouraged and united in love, so that they may have all the riches of assured understanding and have the knowledge of God's mystery, that is Christ himself. In him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. So that dedication to being that disciple of Christ, that one who wants to learn Christ, to know him, that is where are hidden the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, if we seek him and his will. Hopefully, as we go to this next topic, this will invoke some opinions and some comments, because the next thing he discusses is corporal punishment. So that's our next topic. My dad used corporal punishment. I get worked pretty good, I guess. I didn't want it. So I guess that was a good deterrent. I've had to use it against my own kids. And I know as parents or grandparents, we have all the sayings like, this hurts me more than it does you, and doing this with love, and, I guess. and so there'll be some, how do we use corporal punishment, and what should it be used for? But so when, my parents told me that about how it hurts them more, and they're doing it with love, it does come from Proverbs. If you look at Proverbs 13:24, and this is some of we'll get into the good spare the rod verses. But 24 says, those who spare the rod hate their kids. So I guess maybe we just turned it around to make it sound better, that I'm whipping you because I love you, I think is what 24 says. But those who love them are diligent to discipline them. Which I think we've talked about before, like disciplining them isn't the punishment. It's the discipline is trying to get them to act better, do better, be better. So when we discipline kids, we actually want the behavior to change to a more positive. There's cases where whippings wouldn't work. So when if you're trying to discipline, then it's got to be something that changes behavior. If it doesn't change behavior, then it's not actual discipline. So I think, especially up to a certain age, corporal punishment could work, but we know that oftentimes it doesn't. So why would we want that proper discipline, or what would be our objectives? So if we look at Proverbs 22:15, folly is bound up in the heart of a boy, but the rod of discipline drives it far away. And then again in 23:13 and 14, do not withhold discipline from your children. If you beat them with a rod, they will not die. If you beat them with the rod, you will save their life from Sheol. And then in 29:15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a mother is disgraced by a neglected child. And then 17 says, discipline your children, and they will give you rest. They will give delight to your heart. So I guess another one is we could tell them we're saving their life by whipping them, or like You know, uh, we're doing it with love and all those things. And I guess that's where those uh, comments, in the sayings come from. It's emphasize and make sure that we don't strike in anger. Is one of the points he makes that we've just read about 5 scripture on why we should discipline our kids, but then how should we do it? Not putting it off. Uh, um, or putting it off until your anger maybe goes away, because I know that's natural. You've told your kids to not do something like 20 times and they do it the 21st and you've just had enough. And so you could act out in anger, which is something he suggests not to do. I know within education, I've never paddled a kid. I know people that have, and I don't know if they still do. I haven't heard. Usually you could listen in the hallways and you could hear somebody getting a paddling when I was in school. They kind of, I guess, have gone away with it. But my thing was, if a kid did something bad enough to need a paddling, I didn't probably need to do it, because I figured like my anger, like I might, not know. I mean, UNA didn't teach us how to paddle when I was taking education classes. So like, I don't know, but I never did it. I sent kids to the office who got one. So, and I've always known guys that were good at it. I guess being good at it means it hurts without, hurting them too bad. Usually now with kids, if you ask them if they want the paddling or ISS or something, they're going to pick ISS. Like they don't want the paddling. So corporal punishment, he's saying, has its place, but it's not a way to vent or let off steam. Again, not something that should be done in anger. And it's rather a controlled use of one method that discourages bad behavior. And it should always be accompanied with love. Anybody have any other comments? Good or bad, I guess, stories of corporal punishment, or how advice? It worked because I sometimes had the kids go to their room too, and that was mostly for me because I needed time to not be so mad. Uh, Kevin. Right. And, I don't know, and I don't know if you remember when this changed, but it used to be no question. If the handbook would say, you get a paddling if the principal thinks you do, this is, and, usually you might call the parent, and the parent would say, yes, go ahead. But now there became the notes in the file. So a note in the file means no paddlings. You're not allowed. So then you can't tell a kid, 3 licks might be coming, even if you never did it. Because I know sometimes with our kids, sometimes the threat of a whooping just ended. A lot of times with Kimberly now, like if I just softly mention a whooping's coming, it's bad. She's crying already. Like Eli and Hudson, I had to prove it. So, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but like, especially with multiple kids within the household, they can all be different and need different things. Even amongst boys and then boy and girl differences, because everyone has the different personality. So I don't know exactly how long ago all that started with the notes in the file, but that used to not be a question. I've had kids, sent to the office like, no, I'm not taking a paddling, send me home for 3 days. And the parent comes up there and says, no, you're going to paddle them right now and send them back to class because they don't want them probably at home. But that was probably the option. It's 3 days outside of school or a paddling. That's very interesting. I wouldn't want my kids to have a chance to get me. Uh, well, I know with coaching basketball, like I've had, team messes up or somebody messes up, you've got to run. Well, the kid may jog or not run hard. Who cares, But I've used and I've known coaches to use like the guy who messes up doesn't run. Like he has a stand on the side and he's got to watch his whole team run. And that would stop the behavior because, so kind of like what you're saying, there's no punishment, but just watching someone else be punished was enough to stop the behavior. And I think that's the point of what he's talking about in Proverbs is we need the behavior to change or stop. And sometimes I guess you have to get creative. Yeah, that usually can happen too. Is there's a little team meeting, and the team will take care of him. But those type strategies, like whether it's sending to the room and waiting, or just I know oftentimes during that waiting period, like I would talk with Ashley, like is a whooping expected this time? Or we kind of talk about, well, should they just be grounded this time, or is it it could be whipping and grounding, like so. Just some conversation within that. I know sometimes growing up it was, dad wasn't home yet, and it was mom, or, there's that like 3 hours till dad gets home instead of that. That's even really bad is, you did something at lunch, you got to wait till dad gets home the rest of the day. That's a tough day. But Ephesians 6:4 says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So I think that's just a reminder that with love and that's when we tell them, this. And sometimes, it's true that it hurts you more than them when you whip them, because you don't want to see that, but if you know that it's helping, and it goes back to with basketball too. Like sometimes I question making them run, are they actually getting better? And it makes you think about, well, what other things could we do besides running to correct a behavior, correct a mistake? I guess like if you had a team that loved to run and they could care less, they just run. Same with maybe a kid whose spankings has no effect and something else needs to take place. And that's what's interesting, and I definitely want to get your feedback on this next part, is because it lends for some opinion. But let's look at Proverbs 22:6. And there's a couple different ways people have looked at this verse. So I wanted to I went over this a good bit because I can't decide or if there's some validity to it. So 22:6 says, train children in the right way, and when old, they will not stray. So the most commonly held translation of that is train up a child in the way he should go. This kind of interpretation says the child's outcome is virtually dependent upon the training, especially in spiritual matters. That is, basically, if the child is brought up right with godly parents, the child must turn out right. So if a child is not a faithful Christian, it must always be the failing of the parents. However, this view, and we can get into discussion, but if you think about B.F. Skinner and the different research methods on this, is you're not allowing environment or behavioral, nature versus nurture. You're not having any room for that. So the other way that some people translate this verse is train up a child according to his way or her way, which basically says, train up a child according to his or her inclinations. For example, don't try to force a child who is mechanically inclined or someone who is into trade to be a doctor or a lawyer. Rather, bring up a child according to his or her aptitude, and they will likely continue what they start out in life doing. And he makes mention that oftentimes people have career changes, midlife crisis. Maybe they're only trying to please their parents, and then there's this struggle. I've tried to live exactly like my parents said, and then I guess you hit 30 or maybe 40 is midlife now, right? And you want to change everything because you want to go your own way. So then there's the idea that Proverbs maybe, and then we can discuss after I say this, but Proverbs may not be all spiritual implications, that there's some just advice in raising your kid in general, if that makes sense. And I think that's what he's trying to say is, yes, train up a child in the way they should go, but it's not the way you think they should go, if that makes sense. Like, let your kids' personality and things that they like to do, or their makeup, because all kids are different. With our 5 kids, they're all different. They have all different personalities. So any thoughts about that? Those two various ways to look at it. Yeah, right, right, yeah. Yeah. Right. Mhm. Yeah, I 100% agree with that as far as the basic principles can't waver. I'm thinking maybe in what he just wants to bring out is it can't be like cookie cutter. There's got to be, because I see this in education, like you have the same course material, but kids have to receive it different. So maybe it's just being aware of, yeah, I've got, you know, 1 to 7 kids. They're going to get the same message, but to each one, we may have to produce it different. Like you said, like you got to spank one kid, but you can't the other because they doesn't work. So, um, sometimes maybe doing it just like your dad or granddad or if you have older siblings, you watch them raise their kids. You probably can't raise them the same way. There has to be a different connection there. So I guess I just think that's when he points out the two ways to look at it, uh, which within education I know of parents who push their kid to a trade or a profession, and that could lead resentment in other areas. Like you made me go into this profession, and then you also taught me the Bible. Well, I'm just going to rebel in both ways, maybe is what he's trying to say. But uh, yes. Yeah. Hmm. Well, and I've seen that, with education. I now, because I was talking to some of my former players the other night, and some of my former players are now in their 30s and having families, um, and so you see, well, and they'll even talk about there was a stretch where they weren't doing what they were supposed to, but because of the way they were raised, they had that to go back to. So now that they're starting their family, they're back into the church and they're doing those things because they knew they had to be, and they went back to it, which is better than just saying, well, they're never going to learn, I'm just not going to teach them. So, and I think that's what he wants to point out is if you're head of the household, your job is when they're little to do your job. And then like you're saying, there is, once they get, older, 20s, 30s, there's ownership on them. Because the Bible requires that they lead their new household exactly like they're supposed to. Um, so uh, I think, uh, yeah, it's tough, definitely, especially when there's so much more outside influence. Like I think, and I know it's time, but there's more things that can influence our kids than ever before with internet, social media. And then I think it's being careful, is your influence greater than those bad ones? So I really appreciate all the comments, and we probably could keep going on that. But. Right. Because I don't have any knowledge of horses or how to lead them, and it's hard to believe that something so strong and powerful can just be like goes where you want it to. Like that just, um, it's like if you. I read they were talking about like with the circus with elephants, they train them when they're baby elephants. They can just lead them by a rope, or they'll tie a little rope, and the elephant learns for its whole life that this little bitty rope it prevents it from running away. Like it should just be able to move its legs, snap the rope. But they train the elephants that rope is stronger than them, and they never unlearn that. So yeah. So thank y'all so much.